Good morning, everyone. Today is a very special day for us because we have here one of the most important authors that has a critical approach of contemporary psychiatry. Internationally recognized in this area, Robert Whitaker very kindly accepted our invitation to come to Campinas and present us a lecture entitled Anatomy of an Epidemic, History, Science, and Long-Term Effects of Psychiatric Medications. This event will be spoken in English because it's being broadcasted live over the internet. Mr. Whitaker is a journalist and a writer, specialized in medicine, science, and history. In 2011, his book, Anatomy of an Epidemic, Magic Bullets, Psychiatric Drugs, and the Astonishing Rise of Mental Illness in America, received the title of Best Investigative Journalist Book of the Year. That same year, this work was the subject of an extensive debate launched in the New York Review of Books by Marcia Engel, editor of the New England Journal of Medicine and lecturer at Harvard Medical School. This book is currently being translated by Editora Fiocruz and will be coming out soon in Brazil. Last May 7th, Robert Whitaker and Liza Cosgrove published his last book, Psychiatry Under the Influence, that investigates how the influence of pharmaceutical money and guild interests has, in his terms, corrupted the behavior of the American Psychiatric Association and academic psychiatry during the past 35 years. Professor Lawrence Lessing of Harvard Law School and the director of the Edmond Safra Center for Ethics notes in the foreword to this book, Cosgrove's academic and professional experience, combined with Whitaker's powerful investigative reporting, provide an account that will astonish the fair reader. According to Whitaker and Cosgrove document, that situation has led to significant social injury, and in particular, associated lack of informed consent regarding the use of psychiatric drugs and the pathologizing of normal behaviors in children and adults. This book argues that reforming psychiatry will require the neutralization of these two corrupting influences, pharmaceutical money and guild interests, and the establishment of a multidisciplinary authority over the field of mental health. The main point of the lecture is about to deliver us today is that psychiatric drugs are regularly prescribed on a long-term basis. The understanding is that this practice reduces the risk of relapse. However, a detailed review of the scientific literature reveals a different conclusion. While many people may do fine on psychiatric drugs long-term, on the whole, these medications make long-term outcomes worse. They increase the likelihood that the disorder will run a chronic course. A review of long-term outcome literature provides an evidence-based rationale for rethinking the use of these treatments. In addition, this talk will discuss the financial influences present in American psychiatry that affect the dissemination of information about psychiatric drugs and influence the construction of diagnoses in American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the famous DSM. To take part in debate of his lecture, we invite two very important colleagues from the Department of Psychiatry of Unicamp. Dr. Paulo Dalgalarrondo, who is a psychiatrist, doctor of psychiatry and anthropology, and professor of psychiatry at the University of Campinas. And Dr. Cláudio Banzato, psychiatrist, doctor of philosophy, and professor of psychiatry at Unicamp. We would like to take this opportunity to thank them for their precious contributions for this event. After Mr. Whitaker's lecture, the comments and the comments of the professors, we invite all present participants and those who are following us over the internet to send the questions and comments directly to the lecturer by the email, not this email, another email, mpereira@fcm.unicamp.br, 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 mpereira@fcm.unicamp.br. I'd like to thank again Mr. Robert Whitaker for kindly accepting our invitation for this important event, co-organized by the Laboratory of Psychopathology, Subject and Singularity, and also by the Department of Psychiatry of Unicamp. Now, I may pass our word to Mr. Whitaker, who will start his lecture. Thank you very much.
First of all, I just want to say it's really an honor and a pleasure to be here. So it's my second time in Brazil, and first time I fell in love with your country, so it's so great to be back. The reason we're speaking in English, I don't think it's just because it's being broadcast on the internet, it's because I don't speak Portuguese, much to my regret. So anyway, it's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. Now I'm going to have to see if I can talk while sitting down. I'm used to standing up. Real quickly, Mario gave a very good outline of the presentation. The first part of the majority will be looking at what is science telling us about the long-term effects of psychiatric medications. We're going to look in particular about antipsychotics. And then the second part, we will talk about sort of the influence of financial interests on American psychiatry. And the only reason I think that may be of interest to a Brazilian audience is American psychiatry basically exported an understanding globally. So it affects the world what happens in the United States, for better or for worse. One thing about myself, just so you know, so I am a journalist by background. I've been covering medicine and science for a long period of time. Also, I had a period of time when I was director of publications at Harvard Medical School. And when I was director of publications there in the mid-90s, there was a lot of focus at that time on evidence-based medicine. And one of the concepts of evidence-based medicine, at least which was drummed into my head, is it's possible for doctors to become deluded about their merits of their therapies from just their clinical experience. And so you need to have this sort of scientific look at what you do, and sometimes that will present some surprises. And what I'm trying to say here is I come at this whole story from a very conventional background, reporting, but also within my years at Harvard Medical School as well. And as far as psychiatry, I initially had absolutely conventional understanding of modern psychiatry. And what is that narrative? The narrative goes like this. In 1955, a drug arrives in asylum medicine. In the United States, its brand name is Thorazine. I'm not sure of its brand name in Brazil. Is it Largactil or?
It's Amplixtil.
Okay, so it arrives in asylum medicine. This drug is remembered today as the first antipsychotic, and you hear those words, antipsychotic, as if it's an antidote to psychosis, almost like we have antibiotics that are antidotes to bacterial infections. It's something specific. And part of this story is these antipsychotics make it possible for people with severe illnesses to leave the asylum and live out in the community. That's that great leap forward. Then we get antidepressants, anti-anxiety drugs. So all of a sudden we have antidotes to a lot of mental problems, the main mental problems. And then if we go forward in this history of progress, in 1987, we get a drug called Prozac in the United States. I don't know what it is, Prozac here. This is the first of the second generation psychiatric drugs said to be so much better than the first generation. We get new antipsychotics, etc. And two things here. This is Edward Shorters at the University of Toronto. He says the arrival of chlorpromazine initiates a revolution comparable to the introduction of penicillin in general medicine. Now, there have been few things in medicine as important as the arrival of penicillin. So if this is comparable, this indeed is a great leap forward. And finally, just to complete this narrative, two things. In modern times, we heard that these drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain. You've all heard that in Brazil as well. If that is true, that is a story of a great advance. It means we've identified the pathology of psychosis, the pathology of depression, and now we have drugs that fix that pathology, like insulin for diabetes. That is telling you of great medical progress. And in 1998, our U.S. Surgeon General, who's the top doctor in the United States, commissioned a big report on mental health, 400-page report, and he said this: prior to the arrival of chlorpromazine, we lacked treatments that would prevent people from becoming chronically ill. And now we have this vast array of safe and effective treatments for well-defined disorders that enable people to live fairly normal lives. So that's that big story of progress that is out there in society. And by the way, a story that I completely believed in when I first started really reporting on psychiatry for the Boston Globe in 1998. We wrote about how the drugs fix chemical imbalances, etc. Now, in this latest book, not Psychiatry Under the Influence, but Anatomy of an Epidemic, I started wondering, well, if we have this great progress, why is mental illness becoming an ever greater problem in our society? So as a first step of putting this story of progress under a microscope, I just looked at the number of people in the United States who are unable to function, who are in need of government care due to mental illness. So I went back to 1955 when people were in mental hospitals because they couldn't care for themselves. That's how society took care of the severely mentally ill. And at that time, there were about 350,000 people in the United States in mental hospitals due to psychiatric disorders. We had people with Alzheimer's in those hospitals, etc. But people with a psychiatric diagnosis, it was 350,000. And I looked at the population, and you'll see that's a disability rate of about 200 per 100,000 people. Now, between 1955 and 1987, we deinstitutionalized. I'm not sure when you deinstitutionalized in Brazil. It happened at different times in different countries. But this is when we deinstitutionalized. And what we set up in the United States is a disability system out in the community where you would get a government payment that would pay for your food and your shelter, and often you would be in sort of sheltered housing. And what other researchers have said, if you want to measure the number of people on disability in the United States disabled by mental illness, you have to look at the number of people who've gone on these federal government programs and declared disabled due to mental illness, okay? So in 1987, you look at that, and there were 1.2 million adults on disability due to mental illness in the United States. Now, 1987 is the year that Prozac gets approved for marketing in the United States. And it's since that time that we in the United States have made great use of psychiatric drugs. By the way, in the United States, 1 in 5 Americans now takes a psychiatric drug on a daily basis. Among our children, we're at about 10% of our children are on a psychiatric drug on a daily basis, all school-age children. In terms of spending, we spent about $800 million on psychiatric medications in 1987. Now we spend about $40 billion a year on psychiatric medications. So there's been this 50-fold increase in spending on psychiatric meds. Now in 1987, we had 1.2 million adults on disability. Now we have about 5 million adults on disability. So this 4-fold increase. And this is just the ratio you'll see in terms of by population, it's about a 3-fold increase. Now, I don't think that proves anything about the merits of the medications, but I think it does raise a question about this paradigm of care. Why, as we make ever greater use of psychiatric medications, are we seeing disability rates go up and up? Now, when this book came out, people said, that's just a problem in the United States. It's because you have a poor welfare system. People are going on disability to get access to health care. So since then, I've looked at disability in other Western countries that have really adopted the same biologically based paradigm of care. And what do you see? You see disability rates going up in country after country. This is New Zealand with very good access to social services. They have a universal health care system. That's a fourfold increase in disability in the last 20 years. Australia, fourfold increase in the last 20 years. This is just the number of new cases, number of new individuals going on to disability in Denmark each year. Denmark, as you know, has an extensive welfare system. What do they have? They've had about a tripling of the number of people going on to disability. How about Sweden? Now, this is a little bit different data. So you look at all the people going on disability for different reasons. In 1992, it was about 17% of the new cases were due to mental illness. They're now at 60%. So you see a growing problem there. So the point is, and I do not know your statistics in Brazil, but at least in many Western countries that have adopted this sort of American approach with a lot of diagnosis and a regular use of psychiatric medications, you are seeing rising disability rates. And so I thought that raised the question, then what is science telling us about how these medications affect people over the long term, and not just on the target symptom of, say, psychosis or the target symptom of depression, but also on functional outcomes. How do they affect people's ability to work, socialize? A much more global outcome is what I was looking at. Now, one of the reasons this book has gotten a lot of attention, I think, is how do we assess the merits of drugs? A lot of it does arise in the United States. We run trials with industry funded generally, 6 weeks in length. You have some people put on the drug, some people randomized to placebo. And if after 6 weeks the drug treated group has a greater reduction of symptoms, that drug is approved for the market. So the way we really assess drugs is very short term. And what I'm trying to do today is look at a very different question. What's happening to people over 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, which is a question I think we all want to address. Now, the next thing I wanted to look about in this book, before I even get to the outcomes literature, is how do these medications affect the brain? Now, I left out a slide which maybe I should have put in. So we were told in the United States that these drugs fix chemical imbalances in the brain. So we were told, for example, that depression is due to too little serotonin. The SSRI antidepressants, by upping serotonergic levels or balancing that. We were told, for example, that psychosis and schizophrenia were due to too much dopamine activity. Therefore, if you have a drug that blocks dopamine activity in the brain, that's balancing that problem. And people were said it's like insulin for diabetes. I will tell you, in the United States, that story has completely collapsed now. It is being rejected by psychiatry, and it's being rejected in a very wholehearted way. And the reason is, for 30 years, they looked to see if people with depression, prior to going on medications, did they have low serotonin. They did not find it to be so. Now, the schizophrenia psychosis story is a little bit more complicated. There's still some nuances they're investigating. But did they find that dopamine overactivity was a characteristic function of in all people with schizophrenia? They did not find that. So, for example, you can read a comment by Kenneth Kendler, who's the co-editor-in-chief of Psychological Medicine and one of the world leaders in the search for chemical imbalances. In 2005, he said, "We have searched for big, simple neurochemical explanations for mental disorders and have not found them." Thomas Insel, the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, recently wrote, "That's an outdated theory." And in fact, it was sort of a mistaken theory from the beginning, because it arose not from an understanding of what was going on in the brains of people so diagnosed, but an understanding of how the drugs acted on the brain. So, for example, if you have a drug that ups serotonergic activity, they hypothesized depression is due to low serotonin. They learned that antipsychotics block dopamine receptors, so they hypothesized the pathology is the opposite problem. But then you have to investigate that hypothesis, and they did not find it to be so. And just so you understand, at least in American psychiatry, how far away they are moving from that theory. There's a A former editor-in-chief of Psychiatric Times named Ronald Pies. He's a psychiatrist at Tufts University. And here's what he recently wrote about the chemical imbalance theory of mental disorders. That theory was always a kind of urban legend, never a theory seriously proposed by well-informed psychiatrists. Now, the irony of that is, if you go out to the United States and survey the population, about 87% of the people now know that chemical imbalances cause mental disorders. So here you have a leading psychiatrist said, we never said that, and we have a population that said, what are you talking about? We were all told this. But this is where the situation is. But I will tell you, there is a complete sense that that theory failed. I'll give you one sort of amusing anecdote about that. So in this book, in Anatomy of an Epidemic, I trace the history of investigations into that hypothesis, and then I show that they failed to find these characteristic imbalances, and I sort of say I think psychiatry has been misleading the population about this. So I was giving a grand rounds at Massachusetts General Hospital, which is a Harvard hospital in Boston. It's a real bastion of biological psychiatry. So I was presenting to all the psychiatrists, and afterwards they had someone to give a rebuttal. And the person who gave the rebuttal said, you know, that's a straw man. You said you raised this issue of chemical imbalances to make us look bad. We've known since 1987 that that's an outdated model of mental disorders. Nobody thinks that today. So I said in response, I agree. The theory really fell apart in the 1980s in the investigations. I said, but I'm pretty sure you forgot to tell the American public that. And everybody's head went like this. And I now give talks all around the world, and whenever I talk to patient groups, they're all told they have chemical imbalances. But that theory has fallen apart. So now we have to ask, well, what do the drugs do? How do they act on the brain, and how does the brain respond to those drugs? And you might read a paper by Stephen Hyman, he wrote this paper in 1996 when he was director of the NIMH. He's a neuroscientist at Harvard Medical School. And he says this: these drugs perturb normal neurotransmitter function in the brain. So you have an SSRI that blocks the reuptake of serotonin into the presynaptic neuron. So now that neurotransmitter remains in the gap between neurons longer than normal, right? So you're blocking that normal reuptake function, that ups serotonergic activity. But now he says the brain, because it's a neuroplastic organ, will try to compensate for this perturbation of normal function, and it will try to it will go through these adaptations in order to try to maintain its homeostatic equilibrium. So, for example, you go on an SSRI. So how do neurons communicate? You have a presynaptic neuron that releases that chemical messenger into the tiny gap between neurons, which in English we call the synaptic cleft. That neuron then binds, that neurotransmitter binds with receptors on the receiving neuron, the postsynaptic neuron, right? We say it fits like a key into a lock, and then the brain has to have a way to end that message, and it does so in two ways. That molecule either goes back up via reuptake channels into the presynaptic neurons, or an enzyme comes along, metabolizes that, and it's carted off as waste. So an SSRI blocks the serotonin going back to the presynaptic neuron. It ups serotonergic activity in the synaptic cleft. So what does the brain do? It tries to compensate in two ways. The presynaptic neurons will begin putting out less serotonin than normal, and that adaptation happens for a while. And then the receiving neurons will decrease their number of receptors. They'll become less sensitive for serotonin. And you can see what it's doing. The drug acts as an accelerator. The brain puts down the brake. All right? And this is the new equilibrium. And you'll see, what does he say? The chronic administration of these drugs then cause substantial and long-lasting alterations in neural functioning. And read then what he says in the final thing. After a few weeks, the brain is now functioning in a manner that is, quote, qualitatively as well as quantitatively different than the normal state. So you see a bit of an irony here. We have a conception of the medications as normalizing agents. They normalize brain function. But if you get into the science, we really don't know what is the pathology of these disorders. But what we do see is they're perturbing a normal function, and now it changes the brain into an abnormally functioning state. This is just an example of illustrations I took from a medical textbook. This looks at how two neurons communicate that have dopaminergic tract. You'll see presynaptic neuron puts out the molecule, it binds with receptors. Now what happens after you go on an antipsychotic? Antipsychotic works by blocking those receptors. It gums up those receptors. At a therapeutic dose, it'll block about 70% of a particular type of dopamine receptor called the D2 receptor. So what does the brain do? It grows new receptors. Okay? It's now trying to become super sensitive to dopamine. So the biggest irony is this. Schizophrenia or psychosis was hypothesized to be too much dopamine activity in the brain. They really don't find it as a really characteristic abnormality in people with schizophrenia that's constant. There's some nuances they're exploring. But then they find that after you go on the drug, you do have this hypersensitive state on the dopamine receptors. In other words, the drugs induce the very abnormality hypothesized to cause the problem in the first place. And you'll see that with SSRIs too. It drives the brain into a subserotonergic state. All right? And I will tell you now, in corners of American medicine that are now paying attention to the long-term course of these disorders as medicated, here's what they're saying is the problem. It's this. The drugs stir an oppositional tolerance, okay? They stir this compensatory adaptation, and that drives the brain ultimately into a state the reverse of what is originally intended by the drug. So you think an SSRI is supposed to up serotonergic activity, but it drives your brain into a subserotonergic state. And this person here, Rifel Malik, is an expert in mood disorders. You're going to see various courts for people. He used to work for Eli Lilly doing trials of their drugs. So this is not a critic of SSRIs talking about this. And you'll see, what does he say? Continued drug treatment may induce processes that are the opposite of what the medication originally produced. This may cause a worsening of the illness, continue for a period of time after discontinuation of the medication, and most importantly, may not be reversible. So there's worry that once your brain goes through these compensatory adaptations, changes the density of its receptors, even if you come off, those receptor densities may not renormalize. Okay? They're saying this is why you get a lot of withdrawal effects, but also may mean why it's going to be really hard to ever go off the medication. All right, that's just a different way of conceiving about the medications, and it really has a couple parts. We don't really know the pathology of these disorders, but we do know that the brain is a neuroplastic organ and it'll compensate for the presence of the drug. Now, in this book, I look at antidepressants, long-term course, benzodiazepines in long-term course. The reason I'm going to present on antipsychotics today in detail is because if there's any class of drugs that should have a clear long-term benefit, it's the antipsychotics. They're at this heart of this story that it made it possible to leave the asylums. In the United States for a long time, if you suggested that people with schizophrenia or other psychotic disorders might do better off medication long-term, that was complete heresy. So if there's, and then they're also the best studied class of drugs over the long term. So if any place we should see clear evidence, it's with this class of drugs. Now, I'm not going to go into the short-term evidence. We've already talked about that. There's a lot of studies where you take people coming into emergency rooms, give half an antipsychotic, half a placebo. Do you find over 6 weeks that there's a greater reduction of psychotic symptoms in the drug-treated group? You do. Okay? But now let's go forward in history. You're a clinician in the 60s. You're giving people these drugs. You see it work. Your next question is, how long should people be on these medications, right? So beginning in the 60s, they ran studies designed like this. They would take those group of people who were good responders to the drug, and they had to be good responders because they had to be stable. It's a select group. Half would be abruptly withdrawn from the drug. Half would be maintained on the drug. And with great regularity, those withdrawn from the drug relapsed at a higher rate. Their psychosis came back. So the clinician said, see, you take away the drug and the disease returns. And that's why we have to maintain people long-term on the drugs, is because they lower the risk of relapse. And in 1995, there was a meta-analysis of all the drug withdrawal studies by Patricia Gilbert, and she summarized the data, and you'll see the relapse rate is much, much higher for the drug-withdrawn groups. And you'll see the efficacy of these medications in reducing the risk of psychotic relapse has been well documented. This is your evidence base for long-term use, okay? Now, is there a flaw in that evidence base? There's a couple flaws. One is, does the withdrawal studies tell you anything about how people are functioning 2 years later, 5 years later, 10 years later? They don't. What they tell you is once you're on medication and if you stabilize well, don't come off abruptly. Really bad idea. But they don't tell us about how people are functioning. That's one flaw. Two, if you look at the studies, there are very few gradual withdrawal studies. Most of them are abrupt withdrawal. Okay? And we now know that design in itself increases the risk that a person will relapse, that abrupt withdrawal. So you see, it's not telling us about long-term functioning, and we also have a study design that is increasing the risk of relapse in those withdrawn. And by the way, it's also being conducted in a group of good responders, so it's not telling us about the universe of people on these drugs. Now, remember I'm a journalist, okay? So I'm trying to proceed step by step. Okay, what is the evidence base for use? I found it. This is what's cited. Now I'm going to go through the literature. I'm going to say, can they show me other studies that show that these medications are improving the long-term course? Okay, I'm going through the literature. And when you do that, you find people saying, we don't have that evidence. So, for example, Emanuel Stipp in 2002, this was on the 50th anniversary of the discovery of chlorpromazine. He asked this very important question. After 50 years of these drugs, are we able to answer this? Are these drugs effective in treating schizophrenia? There is no compelling evidence on the matter when long-term is considered. So do you see why this is important to me as a journalist? It's saying that someone who's in the know reviewed the long-term literature and says, we don't have the evidence we're improving the long-term course. And then read the second part of this. This, for me, was like a green light intellectually. He said, if we wish to base psychiatry on evidence-based medicine, we run a genuine risk in taking a close look at what has long been considered fact. So for me, this was like a green light saying, okay, this is a legitimate inquiry to see if we really now let's look at what evidence there is on long-term outcomes. Might it tell a surprising story? And this was not motivated out of an anti-medication bias. It's like following an evidence-based logical trail. I hope you see that. So, what are we going to do? Let's go back and just find every bit of evidence we can find that bears on this question of how medications may shape long-term outcomes. Now, I haven't put up this slide, but one of the things I did look at, what sort of outcomes were they getting for schizophrenia patients from 1945 to 1955 in the United States in the decade before the arrival of Thorazine, and you find a surprise there. If you look at first episode schizophrenia patients, not chronic patients, but they're coming in for a first episode, 67% would be discharged within 18 months. At the end of 5 years, about 67% would be living independently in their community. These were different studies. And employment rates were above 50%. Now, what that meant, if we go back to that first episode cohort, 33% are becoming chronic, right? All right? And they're the ones that stay in the hospital. And you're a psychiatrist in the hospital. What do you see? A lot of chronic patients. What you forget is the patients that came in and got better. They disappear. And one of the things when we talk about how medications affect long-term outcomes is we have to have some understanding of the natural course of the disorder. So we've all heard of Hippocrates. He says, don't make your patients worse, or do no harm, he says. Well, what does that really mean? One of the things Hippocrates is saying is there's often a natural capacity to recover in nature, and your intervention has to do better than that natural capacity to recover. So, for example, let's say you have a disease where you treat it, and 50% of people are cured with your intervention, and the other 50% stay the same. No one gets worse from the moment you first see them. Have you done no harm? No one got worse, so you've done no harm, right? You don't know, Hippocrates would say. Because let's imagine in nature the natural recovery rate for that disease is 70% and the 30% stay the same. That means you've actually lowered the recovery rate. So I just want, when we talk about the effect of medications on long-term outcomes, it's not that some people aren't doing good on the medications. The question is, how are you shifting the overall aggregate spectrum of outcomes? And you have to have some understanding of the natural capacity to recover. Okay, real quickly, early studies on this. In the early 1960s, the NIMH ran a 9-hospital trial, had 4 arms, 3 with drug, 1 with placebo. After 6 weeks, the drug-treated group was doing better. But many in placebo patients had also improved. They discharged them, and at the end of 1 year, they found something odd. The drug-treated patients had higher relapse rates. They were more likely to have come back to the hospital. Very first moment in the long-term literature. Then a person named Sanborn Bachhoven did a retrospective study. He had outcomes for a group of patients treated in 1947 with psychosocial care but no drugs. He had a similar matched cohort of patients in 1967 treated with psychosocial care plus drugs. 5-year outcomes, what did he find? He found that the modern group had higher rehospitalization rates and were much more socially dependent. They weren't working as much. So he says if we want to think about long-term clinical improvement, we may need to rethink this. Then in the 1970s, the National Institute of Mental Health conducts 3 studies that are meant to revisit the long-term course of schizophrenia. And without going into, they all had this design, a randomized design. Either people going on drug, conventional care, or not on drug. Now in this drug arm, they often would get a lot of psychosocial care in this experimental arm. And sometimes there was a selective use model. If they didn't get better within 4 or 5 weeks, some patients would be put on drug, okay? But what did they find each time? They found that the outcomes were better in the experimental arm each time, and along 2 dimensions, lower relapse rates, and more important, better functioning, okay? All 3 studies. And at this point, a man named William Carpenter, who's still a famous name in American schizophrenia research, raises this really important question. This is in 1977. Now think of the data he has. He has data showing that once you're on the medication, if you come off, you relapse at high rates. But now he's got these new studies showing that if you never put them on in the first place, it's the drug-exposed patients who have higher relapse rates. So see how he sums up the evidence. There is no question that once patients are placed on medication, they are less vulnerable to relapse if maintained on the drugs. That's the relapse studies. But what if these patients had never been treated with drugs to begin with? We raised the possibility that antipsychotic medication may make some patients more vulnerable to future relapse than would be the case in the normal course of the illness. Now you see why this is so threatening? We're not talking about adverse events here with antipsychotics. We're talking about the target symptom of psychosis. And the worry that has arisen is that the drugs induce some change that makes people more vulnerable to psychosis. The very symptom you're trying to treat. At that time, 2 researchers from McGill University say, we think we know what's happening. You go on these drugs, they block dopamine receptors. Your brain now increases its dopamine receptors, and it has 2 consequences. Okay, drug blocks dopamine. Your brain puts down extra receptors. Now you come off. You see the problem? You have this abnormality. And they say that's why you're getting such severe relapses when you come off. But they said, even if you stay on, you're still getting this increase in receptors, and maybe because of that, over time, you're going to end up with a dopaminergic system that is somewhat dysfunctional, and when that happens, maybe you're going to develop sort of a chronic psychotic course. And you'll see this. An implication is that the tendency towards psychotic relapse in a patient who has developed such a supersensitivity, and basically everyone does, is determined by more than just the normal course of the illness. Then they did a study of 216 patients. Now at this time, tardive dyskinesia was being recognized. That's the motor disabling adverse event. And that was occurring at about 5% a year in American patients. And they concluded that about 3% of patients per year develop this chronic psychosis, and such that after 10 years on the drugs, about 30% of patients are chronically psychotic. So this is raised in the early 1980s. It's a very sort of, it's a nuanced picture. And there are stories of Guy Chenard and Barry Jones presenting this data to groups of psychiatrists, and psychiatrists standing up and saying, are you telling me the very drug I use to treat patients is making them more psychotic over the long term? And you can see how that would be so, stir a lot of cognitive dissonance, right? Anyway, at this point, this worry gets pushed aside. And so now let's see, as we go for the research in the last, say, 25, 30 years, is there reason to believe this might be a worry, or has the worry been distinguished, okay? And I'm going to just find whatever research I can find. Well, real quickly, there were cross-cultural studies done by the World Health Organization, which compared outcomes in 3 developing countries. These go back to the 1970s. One study was 2 years in length, one was 5 years in length, and by the way, these are people being diagnosed by Western standards. And each time they found out that the outcomes were much better in the 3 developing countries, India, Nigeria, and Colombia. Really, it was India and Nigeria, not so much Colombia, than in the U.S. and other, quote, developed countries. And in fact, the World Health Organization, after the first such study, which was 5 years in length, concluded that, and listen to this, being in a developed country is a strong predictor that you won't have a good long-term outcome. And it was actually this study that made me interested in this whole field, like why living in a rich country should be a predictor of a poor outcome. And again, good social outcome. After the first study, they hypothesized maybe the reason for the better outcomes in the poor countries is they were more medication compliant there. They took their antipsychotics more regularly, a valid hypothesis. If the antipsychotics are supposed to be essential, then medication compliance should lead to better outcomes. What did they find? That in the poor countries, particularly India and Nigeria, they used the medications differently. They used them acutely, not chronically. So only 16% regularly maintained on the drug. So at least in this cross-cultural study, you see better outcomes where they're not maintaining their patients regularly on antipsychotics long term. We're just going to find a bunch of different data points, okay? Next, we get MRI studies. MRI technology, we can now start measuring brain volumes. Now, one of the first research that is done, they put macaque monkeys on either olanzapine or Haldol at doses appropriate for their weight. And then they have a group of matched controls. They sacrifice the monkeys after a couple of years. They weigh their brains. And those that are exposed to either the newer drugs or the older drugs, they have about 10%. They weigh about 10% less. So at least in monkeys, you see this shrinkage associated with the use of the drugs. Now, the best long-running study we have in living patients with schizophrenia has been done on brain volumes, has been done by Nancy Andreasen. She's the former editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Psychiatry, a mainstream person. Her theory was that schizophrenia is a neurodegenerative disease characterized by brain volume loss over time due to the disease, not the drug, okay? So what does she report? And this is a large study, about 500 people, which in the schizophrenia study is a large study. She says, yeah, that's what we see. Over time, you see brain volumes declining in schizophrenia patients, okay? But she's attributing it to the disease, not the drug. But then we get the animal research, and then she says this. As this brain shrinkage happens, it's associated with the worsening of negative symptoms. That's a lethargy, increased functional impairment, and after 5 years, cognitive decline. So in her model, it goes like this. This disease, schizophrenia, is a neurodegenerative disease. We get this reduction in brain volumes, and it causes this deterioration. Okay? It's due to the disease, not the drug, she's saying. And unfortunately, our drugs don't stop that brain volume loss. But then we get this monkey study, and now she looks. Is it due to the drug or the disease? And in 2011, she says it's associated with drug use and not associated with severity of illness and substance abuse. So you see what you're seeing here? You're seeing a model here of where you give a person a drug, it causes brain volume loss, and that's actually associated with a deterioration in functioning over a long time, causes the prefrontal cortex to slowly atrophy. We have a recent study, 43 brain imaging studies. You see loss is greater, significantly more severe in medicated patients. Now, this was a recent paper done by German psychiatrists who included one of the top German psychiatrists in the country. They reviewed this literature, and what did they say? And you can read it here. They say it's pretty clear that the drugs, antipsychotics, are reducing brain volumes, even depends on dosage, exerts adverse effects on neurocognition, negative and positive symptoms, and psychosocial functioning. And based on this understanding, maybe we should rethink long-term use of these drugs. You can see they're describing an iatrogenic process. Now, this is the best long-term prospective study, and I'm going to try to get through this so I don't go over my hour. This is done by Martin Harrell. It goes back to the late 1970s. It's a prospective study. He enrolls 200 patients into this study, and it's going to be a naturalistic study. Everybody's going to be treated with drugs. They're going to be discharged, and then he's going to just follow them at 2, 4.5, 7.5, 10, and 15 and 20 years. Some people are going to take themselves off, and he's going to follow them. He's going to monitor medication usage, etc. And what's nice about this, you see about half its first episode. It's a young cohort, so we're getting people early in the course. Now think about this. We have two narratives here. We have the conventional narrative, which is that the medications are absolutely essential. If that's so, we should see medication compliance in this study associated with better outcomes. And that's what Martin Harrow thought he would see. He actually thought he would document how bad it was for those who went off medication. But if the story, if I'm telling you, is predictive, we should see the reverse. We actually should see medication compliance associated with worse outcomes. So you can see the dueling narratives at work here. Okay, this is anxiety symptoms. After 2 years, this is an older time, of the 60, oh, by the way, so he enrolls 200 patients. At 15 years, he still has 145 patients in his study. Any of you who do research know that that's a really good, you haven't lost many patients. By 2 years at this time, about 25 of the 64 schizophrenia patients have taken themselves off antipsychotics, okay? They've just done it themselves. And you'll see there's no difference at this time. In other words, the people off medication aren't doing well. They're very anxious. So are the people on. But look what happens between year 2 and 4.5. The anxiety symptoms abate in the off medication group. And this is the only place in the literature where you see this longer perspective. Remember, the relapse studies tell you what happens when you come off right away, right? This is telling of a longer healing process. How about cognitive function? It's better for the off medication group at every time. How about work history? Okay, now this he's dividing his patients a little differently. He's dividing his patients who were off by year 2 and stayed off the entire time to those who were medication compliant. Look at the difference in work history. There's a lot of work going on in the off medication group. By the way, this group disappeared from the mental health system. They became, there was a teacher, there was a lawyer, and you can be sure that once they escaped and had this healing, they stopped identifying as having a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Psychotic symptoms. Look at the group always on antipsychotics. Are those drugs controlling the psychotic symptoms? That's the red bar. It's not, right? You're not seeing symptom control here, yet with the group off, you see again this healing between year 2 and 4.5. Recovery rates, he defined recovery rate. You had to be working, asymptomatic, or in school, and had a pretty good social life, 8-time higher recovery rate. This is a spectrum of outcomes. He had good, recovered, so-so, uniformly poor. You'll see that the whole spectrum of outcomes has shifted. Many more in the uniformly poor in the medicated group, many fewer in the recovered group. How many of you have heard this? This is this is what he said at the 2008 meeting. From the best long-running prospective study. This is my beef as a journalist. When we get results like this, they're not promoted by the American Psychiatric Association. They're not promoted in textbooks. They're not promoted on their websites. So if it had been the reverse, if the medicated patients had done much better, do you think you would be hearing about that? We would. This is part of the problem, I think. This is the other psychotic patients. He had 81 with milder psychotic disorders. You'll see they did much better off. Please look at this graphic. So he ends up with 4 groups: schizophrenia on and off, milder on and off, okay? The milder had a better prognosis at start, but how does it end up? Schizophrenia on meds is the worst, then other disorders on meds is the next worst. Why does schizophrenia off meds end up better than milder psychotic disorders on meds? So you can see why that presents a challenge. And then he raises this question. He's going back to the oppositional tolerance question. It's really not so unique that a drug can lose its effectiveness over time and become either ineffective or harmful. So you see that the researchers that have done the very best long-term prospective study are questioning the long-term merits of antipsychotics. Now, real quickly, and I'm going to finish this up and go in a little bit of psychiatry under the influence. There was a randomized study. The complaint about Harrow's study, it wasn't randomized. So maybe it was just somehow something distinct by those who took them off. That's why they had better outcomes. We now have a randomized study out of the Netherlands. They stabilize people on drugs, and then they randomize a group to either a drug tapering protocol or a drug maintenance protocol. Look at this data. This is really interesting. Now, the group that was randomized to tapering or drug continuation had a higher relapse rate in the first 2 years. Didn't mean they were re-hospitalized, but they had a return of symptoms, okay? So if you stop this study after 2 years, what does it tell you? Got to be on your drugs. Higher relapse rates coming off. But they continued it. And by the end of 7 years, there was no difference in the people who had experienced a return of symptoms. But here's the key thing. In those randomized to the drug discontinuation tapering group, the recovery rate was more than twice as high. This is basically now, after the initial randomization, it does become a bit of a naturalistic study. There's people in the regular maintenance drug that take themselves off. So this is just a grouping of all the patients that ended up off drugs or down to a low dose. You'll see better symptom remission in that group, better functional remission, much higher full recovery rates. So what does Lex Wunderich says? And this is really interesting. He says we've been looking at the wrong thing. We've been looking at relapse rates upon drug withdrawal, and that's just a symptom-based measure. We need to look at functional outcomes. Okay, and we need to take a longer look at things. Now, when I wrote Anatomy of an Epidemic, I will be honest with you, when it first came out, it was treated as complete heresy to even raise this issue of long-term effects of antipsychotics. But now you're hearing in sort of mainstream places, some say, uh-oh, maybe we do need to rethink this. This is the British Journal of Psychiatry saying, watch this, this is not a wild cry from the distant outback, but a considered opinion by influential researchers. Even director of the NIMH saying, look at Wunderich and Harrow, we have to ask ourselves, what does this say about the long-term use of these drugs? Are they potentially harmful? Are they necessary? Maybe we need to say some people do better off the medications. Now, the beauty of this story is there is a group in northern Finland that, and maybe we can talk about this more in the discussion, that rethought its use of antipsychotics in the early 1990s. They have a form of care called open dialogue therapy. It emphasizes a lot of psychosocial care, integrating people back into the community, and a selective use of drugs. It's not an anti-drug model. When people come in, they try to get people through the psychotic episode without putting them on antipsychotics. They may use benzodiazepines to restore sleep-wake. Then if someone is not doing better after 6 weeks, they do put them on medication. And then if after 6 months of those on medication, they see who can go off and who has to stay on. You know, they've been doing this since 1992, and they now have by far the best long-term outcomes in the Western world. At the end of 5 years, 80% of their patients are working or back in school and asymptomatic. Only 20% have gone on to chronic conditions. In terms of medication use, only 1/3 are ever exposed to antipsychotics, and about 20% are on the drugs long term. I love this because it's not an anti-drug model, it's a selective use model. Anyway, real quickly, you'll see, he says, yeah, we have to use neuroleptics in a selective fashion. If we did the antidepressant literature, here's the story you'd see. Depression runs a much more chronic course in epidemiological studies than it used to. In other words, medicated depression does. If you do studies today that compare, you look at people who have been on medication, stay on medication versus those off medication, the off medication group is much less likely to be symptomatic 5 and 10 years later, has much better functional outcomes. And if you look at this, researchers are now saying, are these drugs in fact depressogenic? In other words, do they induce a chronic course over the long term? You'll see this is Giovanni Fava. He's an editor of Psychotherapy and Psychosomatics Journal in Italy. And you'll see what he's saying here, the very story I'm talking about. Yeah, the drugs can be effective over the short term, but when we prolong this treatment, maybe we get this oppositional tolerance. And now once that happens, when you end the drug treatment, that's why you get relapses. But even if you stay on, you get this increased vulnerability to relapse. Go back to Refill Malik. You can just read that. Just read this. I hope you see in these comments that this is not just this journalist raising crazy questions, that that as people are looking at long-term outcomes, they're really worrying about the long-term effects of these medications, and they're going back to this oppositional tolerance. By the way, I don't think tardive dysphoria, though, is exactly depression. You know, depression hurts, right? When you get depressed, you hurt. Tardive dysphoria is more like an inability to feel, a numbing of feel, an inability to mount emotional reactions to the world. So it's really not tardive depression. It's something different that they're talking about here. If you go through, look at bipolar outcomes, they've worsened over the past 30 years, functional outcomes. Anyway, so what do I believe the problem with psychiatric drugs are? And this has been a very sort of short version of this. I mean, you really need to dig into the research literature. I think we are seeing that the burden of mental illness is going up in country after country that has adopted this biological drug-based paradigm of care. 2, because we do not know the pathology of these disorders, what are we doing with these drugs? We're perturbing otherwise normal functioning. The brain tries then to adapt to the presence of the drug. And then if we really look at the literature, what do we see? Drugs that are effective over the short term, but you see a lot of chronicity over the long term, and you actually, when you start looking at functional outcomes, you see a lot of impairment in functioning. So I think what science is telling us is we really need to rethink this paradigm of care, even rethink about, conceptions of what is going on with people who have mental disorders and diagnosed, et cetera. I think what literature is telling us is we need a fundamental rethinking of what is going wrong and how to treat it, and really a paradigmatic shift. So real quickly on psychiatry under the influence, why do we believe what we believe? And that's this new book I have, and I'll do this for about 5 minutes. In 1980, the American Psychiatric Association produced the 3rd edition of its Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. Now, if you look at DSM-1 and DSM-2, they had a lot of Freudian or psychoanalytic and psychodynamic explanations for what goes wrong with people. In other words, it happens often out of stress in life, unconscious problems, so it's a psychological sense to them. But what was happening in American psychiatry in the 1970s? 2 things. Psychiatry itself was talking, we're on the verge of extinction. There was a sort of an anti-psychiatry movement, but also what we call the walking wounded, the non-severely mentally ill, will often go to psychologists for help, social workers for help, and psychiatry as talk therapy was much more expensive. So psychiatry, American psychiatry, felt its place in the talk therapy or the psychiatric medical marketplace imperiled. And you can see this in the documents. And they say to themselves, well, what is our advantage in this marketplace? We're doctors. They're not doctors. What can doctors do, at least in the United States, that the social workers and the psychologists do? They can prescribe. And they said, if we want to restore our image, what is the image that has such resonance in society? It's the white coat image. It's doctors, right? And so basically they're going to adopt a medical model. There are some scientific impulses around doing research, but it's also a strategy for elevating the status of American psychiatry and presenting to the population an image of medical doctors treating medical disorders. But it comes out of sort of a marketplace decision. And so what do they do with DSM-3? They now characterize, I forget the number of disorders, 275, and what do they say? They say, we're going to consider these as diseases of the brain, right? You can see Nancy Andreasen say they're diseases of the brain, depression, ADHD, etc., just like heart disease is or cancer is. So now we're going to move into this medical model. Now, who loves this? The drug industry. Because in order to get a drug approved for marketing or sale, you cannot get a drug approved for neurosis. You can get a drug approved for depression that is a medical disease. You can get a drug approved for anxiety that's a medical disorder. So watch what happens in terms of, this is money now going from the pharmaceutical industry to the American Psychiatric Association. 1980, if you look at annual revenues, it was about $10 million for the association. They were only getting a couple million, $4 or $5 million from the drug industry. Look what happens. The drug industry starts pouring money into the APA. And they pay money for fellowships. They pay money for symposiums at the annual meeting. So any of you have been to the annual meeting, right? Have you been to the annual meeting of the APA?
Yes.
At least in the past, you'd go, they'd have these wonderful lunches and dinners and breakfasts, and they'd have talks by leading psychiatrists, and this would be the latest news about this validated disorder or the wonders of this drug. Those talks were paid for by the drug companies. They paid the APA to give those talks, and they paid the people giving the talks. But they were presented as scientific symposiums, and this is one of the ways that we began exporting this medical model to psychiatrists around the world. And by the way, the drug companies would often fly psychiatrists to those meetings for free. It was a way to basically promote this model. Anyway, you can see the money going in. Dramatic increase in the APA. It's like a 7-fold increase in annual revenues. Now, the second thing, what did the pharmaceutical companies do? They began paying academic psychiatrists at prestigious institutions in the United States, Harvard, Stanford, Johns Hopkins, to be their advisors, speakers, consultants, okay, and to do their studies. And, by the way, to validate the disorders. So they would be serving on DSM panels. They'd set the boundaries for a disorder. Then they'd go out and say these are real, and then they'd go out and say the drugs are good. So how much money were these people getting? Well, this is an example of 4 people that just came out when Senator Grassley did an investigation. Joseph Biederman. Now, Joseph Biederman has helped open the market for 2 classes of drugs. ADHD, he was the big person saying you need to have stimulants, and then also antipsychotics for juvenile bipolar disorder. He at one point had contracts with 24 different drug companies. One company alone, which was paying him basically to open the market for the prescribing of Risperdal to bipolar patients, paid him $1.6 million. So this is not insignificant money. Frederick Goodwin, he's a former NIH director. He was being paid basically to promote a mood stabilizer for bipolar. These other 2 were paid to open up the market for antidepressants in children. So my point is, these leading American psychiatrists who go around the world speaking about the validity of disorders, the prevalence of these disorders, the merits of these drugs, and do the studies, you have to understand they're a compromised lot because they were bought going back in the 1980s. And by 1998, by the way, the New England Journal of Medicine, when it tried to find an expert in depression to do a review of the effectiveness of antidepressants, said we're having trouble finding anyone in American psychiatry who's not taking money from the drug companies. That's how pervasive it became. This is just looking at, he mentioned that I co-wrote this book with Lisa Cosgrove. She's done this research, just looking at DSM-4, the task force. How many of the people on that task force had relationships with pharmaceutical companies? You'll see it's the majority. And then you have work panels for the individual disorders, right? Well, they set boundaries for anxiety, sleep disorders, schizophrenia. You'll see psychotic disorders. Every single person on that panel, the DSM-4 panel, was taking money from drug companies. Just shows the extent of the influence. DSM-5, it's still there. Now, real quickly on this, I just want to show how there's sort of a web on this. So in the early 1990s, Prozac was already out. Zoloft was already out, and now we get SmithKline brings a drug called Paxil to market. Do you have Paxil here? Do they call it Paxil? And they said, and they said, how are we going to compete? And they decide to reposition the drug as an anti-anxiety drug. So what do? They go and hire the people who've been on the DSM-4 work group for anxiety disorders to be their advisors. Okay, they bring him to this meeting in 1993. This is actually as this group is forming, and they say, you need to help us rebrand our drug as an anti-anxiety drug. And now you can find, they make Ballinger one of their consultants, and what does he do? He does studies showing that Paxil is good for panic disorder. He also does studies saying it's much more prevalent than we used to think. He does the same for general anxiety disorder, and you find him now going around the world giving this talk. And you'll see Michael Leibowitz. We have something called social anxiety disorder, which is sort of extreme shyness. He's the one in the 1980s starts saying it's quite prevalent. They hire him. He now produces studies saying it's very prevalent. It's a disease that can be that can be fatal if left untreated, is one of the things we heard. Very prevalent, and Paxil is good for that. I know they pay him to give talks. My point to this is as you look to see how new narratives are built and you expand the market, what you can look at is you can see that there are American psychiatrists who will be serving on the DSM panels that construct these diagnoses. Then they'll do research saying, they'll say, we've validated these disorders as real. They'll say they're quite prevalent, much more prevalent than we used to think. If untreated, it's horrible, and then they'll be speaking about that. And then they'll do the research showing the drug is effective. My point is this expansion of this market has happened under the influence of pharmaceutical money. And the other influence, and then I'll stop, is just there's also a guild interest at work. So in American psychiatry, what is its product? After DSM-3, it had 3 products. It had research into the biology of disorders, it had the DSM, and it had drugs. They can hardly produce studies showing that the drugs may not be effective over long term. And so if you look at some of the long-term studies funded by the NIMH, one after another has actually produced really dispiriting results. So for example, the long-term study of stimulants for ADHD found that at the end of 3 years, those medications were a marker for deterioration, not of benefit. At the end of 6 years, in that key study, pivotal study, the medicated students had more ADHD symptoms, higher delinquency rates, and impaired functioning. Now, were those results promoted to the public? They were not. And why not? Because it goes against guild interests. The STAR-D study, and then I'll stop. STAR-D study was the largest antidepressant trial ever conducted. It was done in real-world patients funded by the NIMH. And it was supposed to guide use of antidepressants in the United States. The announced results were this. 67% of people remitted on drugs eventually. And that was so eventually keep trying, you'll find a drug that works. Here are the real results. Only 38% ever remitted, and they buried the real result. At the end of 1 year, of 4,041 patients, and this trial was meant to show that you can stay well on antidepressants. There were only 108 patients still in the trial, hadn't relapsed, either remitted and hadn't relapsed. That's a documented stay well rate of 3%. They did not announce that at all. Then you look at, now it's an NIMH-funded trial, but to the investigators in that trial, do they also have contacts to the pharmaceutical industry? I just looked at the investigators. Look at this. Look at how many ties they have to the drug industry, including the maker of the first drug used. So these investigators, they basically committed fraud in this study, and I could go through how they did it. They have 2 influences. They have the influence of pharmaceutical money, and they're protecting guild influences. And so instead of a story going out to the world at large, that in this largest antidepressant trial ever conducted, only 3% remitted and stayed well, we got a message that 67% were cured. And so, and I'll stop now. This is the problem. American psychiatry has exported a narrative of biological psychiatry that tells of validated brain disorders, of drugs that are highly effective, etc., effective over the long term. But that is a narrative exported under the influence of pharmaceutical money and guild interests, and when you dig into the science, it is ultimately a false story. Thanks.
We would like to thank you, Mr. Whitaker, for this brilliant and very polemic speech. I'm sure that all the participants here and people that are following you over internet are eager to debate all these ideas with you. But before that, I invite right now Professor Banzato to share his insights about your lecture, followed by Professor Dalgalahondo. Each one will dispose up to 10 minutes for their comments. After that, you will have 10 minutes to respond their questions. Thank you, Professor Banzato. You may have 10 minutes.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mario, for inviting me here for comment this lecture. And thank you very much, Mr. Whitaker, for your very thought-provoking lecture. You raised a number of very relevant and important issues. I'll be delighted to talk longer about them, but I'll try to keep my comments short. First of all, I would like to point out that I deal on daily basis with schizophrenic patients with very severe forms of schizophrenia, both as inpatient unit as in outpatient facilities. And so my sample that I deal with daily is a very severe, and most of patients are refractory, and just to establish this point of view. I'm also interested in conceptual issues of psychiatry that you hinted about, and they are very relevant for this debate. First of all, I would like to say that you are right regarding saying that psychiatry has a lot of unwarranted claims. You're right about that. And this is important because this plays a sort of rhetoric role that you pointed out. And I think that's one clear example is this specificity of drugs for disorders. We don't have disorder-specific drugs. That should be very clear. And it's also right to my mind that psychiatry has been feeding for long on unfulfilled promises. And sometimes publications and DSM present knowledge in a way far more neat than actual knowledge. So I think it's very important to be critical about these foundations of psychiatry. Regarding antipsychotic drugs, which I'm going to focus mainly, I would say that first, it's very important not to underplay the impact, the potential devastating impact of schizophrenia. It's a very severe, disabling, deteriorating, very often, illness, and affects young people, so impact can be huge. The burden of schizophrenia can be huge. And it's very important then that we treat these patients and we do our best to keep them free of symptoms, functional, and this is what we need to do. And certainly antipsychotic drugs are far from perfect. They're very problematic drugs. We wish we had better drugs to use to these patients, but currently they are an important part of treatment, and you said that, especially in the short term. There is some, there is a principle of good clinical practice. You should use antipsychotic in low doses, as low as possible, and for the minimal possible time. You should not use them longer than necessary. And it's very difficult to sort out in practice which are the patients who need to be on long-term treatment with this sort of drugs, and which patients can fare well without them. This is the $1 million question, to sort these patients out. And it's important to say that, for instance, and I see this on a daily basis, a new psychotic episode, a relapse, can be devastating because the patient can reach a new low. So I understand that clinicians usually try to be on the safe side. What you're saying and showing is that, you shouldn't be in this sort of comfort zone, so sure about yourself that you are playing safe. with these drugs. And I think it's a very sobering and important message. It's a humbling in some way. And I think good clinicians should be humble, especially when they are dealing with this sort of potentially devastating conditions. I think one big problem with these long-term studies, and there are many other that were not quoted here today, many other studies, and including long-term studies. And one problem is that our diagnostic criteria change over time. And this is the history of schizophrenia. For example, in the 60s, the American diagnostic criteria, the clinical practice, the usual clinical practice, were to take this criteria very broadly. And if you, for instance, diagnosis of schizophrenia is different if you compare ICD and DSM. If you build in some sort of prognostic criteria, then you have a more strict diagnosis. Though this is not a very logical move to build in prognosis into diagnosis. It is sort of problematic. But this is particularly important in schizophrenia, which is a highly heterogeneous conditions. So this is the boundaries. The boundaries can be more firm if you take this strict or narrow diagnostic criteria approach. And this is also a problem that affects this DOS-MED studies by Ablansky, the WHO studies, etc., etc. So what I'm saying really is that conceptual and empirical problems in psychiatry issues, they're intertwined. And so this is very important to have a strong conceptual criticism of the underpinnings of psychiatric theory and practice. So this sort of challenge, I think it's very healthy and very welcome to that sense. In order to put you some questions for you, I would say that there are some studies that show that most of the loss in terms of functionality, most of the impairment of the patient happens before, first in schizophrenia, happens before treatment. Because when you have what we call positive symptoms, hallucinations, delusions, disorganization of speech or behavior, very often patient has presented some sort of social withdrawal and cognitive impairment and things like that. So, so this tells a great deal about the nature of this debilitating condition. So you have this early functional impairment. And secondly, and we see that a lot, is that it's not tremendous in terms of effect size, but it's a robust finding that the duration of untreated psychosis is a good predictor of poor prognosis. And especially in poor countries, we have a lot of untreated patients. And and these untreated patients tend to, I'm not saying they're not treated by drugs, they're untreated, full stop. Of course, you can say that we should treat them. What we're questioning here is just the the relative importance of drug and for how long and things like that. But I think it's important to keep that in mind, that this decline can occur prior to treatment, and also that this duration of untreated psychosis is a predictor, even in the long term, up to 25 years. The duration of untreated psychosis can be important even decades after. And the third point I already mentioned is this possibility that each new episode may put patient in a new low. We've seen many patients that have, relapses over the time and go back to the prior level of functioning. But it's hard to guarantee that. So prevention of relapse can be very important in that regard. But I fully agree with you that to treat, it's not the same thing as to treat with drugs. And so I think we are in accordance about that. What I'm saying is there is certainly, and you pointed out very well, some sort of research gap that we should be doing. We should be trying alternatives for long term. We should try different protocols. And perhaps this is the main scientific message of your talk. We should be trying to take these drugs off gradually, see what happens, try to study which patients should stay on medication continuously. Most of my patients, as I said, are refractory. And part of them do well with long-term drugs. And it's very hard to challenge that. They are happy, they are functional. And but overall, I would say that schizophrenia, with all this diagnostic criteria change and concept change since Kraepelin, remains a very important challenge. And I think we should be humble to admit that and try to do what we deem to be best based on the best scientific evidence to help these patients to get their lives back. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Claude, for very sharp comments. I think that would be better if Robert Whitaker responded to your questions right now, before inviting Paulo to make his comments.
Sure, I basically agreed with everything you said. I really didn't disagree. I mean, here's the thing. Is there impairment of function in people diagnosed with schizophrenia before diagnosis? Absolutely. I mean, of course, you see that when people get isolated, they get afraid. And then the question is, though, then once, and second of all, I think you need treatment. I agree, duration of untreated psychosis, you have people get more isolated, more afraid, that sort of thing. If you go back to that Finnish program that's doing so well, one of the things they're doing so well is identifying psychosis very quickly within their community, so people are getting into treatment. So this is not an anti-treatment thing. I don't think psychosis should go untreated. The question then is what treatment? And then also with a treatment, you have, I think science is telling you, with an extraordinarily difficult challenge. You have a treatment that can help people over the short term, so of course you want to use it. But that initial response may come with a certain cost, because you're going to get this brain change, which may make it more difficult to come off at some point. So, and now this goes to your second point about, I think really we should be talking about the group of schizophrenias rather than schizophrenia as one distinct disorder. There's obviously many different...
As Blair used to say, schizophrenias. Some sort of syndrome.
So you have many different possible courses embedded in that one diagnostic category. And so and you said what this data does is challenge us to rethink what we do. What your last thing is saying, what maybe we need to be humble and rethink about how we use medications, et cetera, and maybe develop new protocols. That's exactly what I think it is telling you. Now, do I think there's easy, clear answers? No, not at all. And I think the answers are very complicated because you don't know which patients are going to be better able to go off, and you don't know which are going to need it. And I think the beauty, again, of the Open Dialogue project in Finland is they don't know how it's going to separate out. Yeah. But what they have created is a way to keep people safe, keep people with intense treatment, and then the patients themselves start sorting themselves out. And some people start getting better in 6 weeks, and they find that if they can, and now this is before they get diagnosed with schizophrenia, they have a psychotic episode, if they can get them through without being put on a medication, which is difficult, it's harder, okay? You're throwing more resources up front. They're finding a lot of percentage of patients, then they have a psychotic episode. They don't go on to schizophrenia. In fact, in this part of Finland, the number of new cases of schizophrenia since they've adopted this protocol has gone way down. Now, why is that? Because the diagnosis of schizophrenia is you've got to be psychotic at least under the DSM, 6 months or more. And what they're doing with this new program, people aren't staying psychotic long enough to move into the schizophrenic category because they're having these people escape.
Yeah, just to add a few things, you mentioned Finland. There is this FIN11 study, recent FIN11 study, showing that because patients with schizophrenia have a mortality gap, an important mortality gap, that clozapine was able to reduce this mortality gap, just to add something to this puzzle.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think all these are so many nuances to this whole story. But I think the biggest picture here is this. We've had a story that schizophrenia is one discrete disorder, at least coming out of the United States. It's not. We've had a story in the United States, I don't know in Brazil, that basically you have to stay on medications for life. Everybody, one size fits all. That's just not supported. And what I think we're very much in agreement here is you get people coming in, they are in need of treatment, they're isolated, they're afraid, they may have really disturbing symptoms. But if you go back to that first moment, there are all sorts of possibilities in that group that come into you. And the question is, how do you maximize the possibility that people will get full lives back? And I think you need a selective drug use protocol. And the problem with that selective drug use protocol is it means it's difficult right up front because you have to manage people within difficult situations. And
not without risks.
Oh, and you know what? They talk about risk. They talk about tolerating the uncertainty of not knowing what is happening to people. And yes, you have to learn how to acknowledge risks. But the risk of medicating everybody long-term is you have a lot of treatment-refractory patients long-term. So there's a risk doing it this way, too.
Not without risk either.
Yes, but the risk is not immediately. So anyway, I completely agree with so much of what he said. Do you need to get people treated? Yes. Do you need protocols that are selective? Yeah, absolutely. And duration and having untreated psychosis is a bad thing. I agree with all that. And humility. American psychiatry has promoted that we know everything idea, and really, these are mysterious disorders. I mean,
Okay, I would like to thank you, Robert Whitaker, for your answers to Claudio Banzato's questions. And now I would like to invite Paulo Galarrondo for making his questions. You may have 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation. It's an honor for us to receive you here in Unicamp. Thank you also for my friend Mario Eduardo Pereira. And before the psychiatric drug era, there are a tradition of follow-up studies on schizophrenia, on psychosis, a large tradition. Manfred Bloyer was the first important author to do this. Especially in Europe, they did a lot of follow-up studies with cohorts of schizophrenic patients. And they found that this is a very, very heterogeneous condition. in this era, some patients have a very positive course with full remission, about 1/3, and 2/3 have a not so good course. It's difficult to study this condition in the long term and to identify what causes benefits, what harm the patients. I will speak on my experience. I have 30 years of medical practice as a psychiatrist. In these 30 years, I have tried to read critically the scientific literature on cause and treatment of schizophrenia. I have tried to read critically and not selectively. In these 30 years, I saw and treated maybe hundreds of patients, more than 100 of patients, most of them schizophrenic patients. I always worked with schizophrenic patients. Many of them on treatment, on drugs. And I have saw patients without drugs that don't take drugs. Then, in my view, in my empirical experience with real people, what I saw, what I see, is that antipsychotic drugs do not cause schizophrenia and do not worsen schizophrenia. In my view, in my experience, antipsychotic tend to improve, especially clozapine, improve some symptoms, not every symptoms, some symptoms. And especially clozapine improve some aspects of quality of life, not every aspect of quality of life. Reduce suicide. And, well, in my view, in resume, these drugs, especially clozapine, do not cure schizophrenia. And we don't know what schizophrenia is.
Okay, Paulo, thank you for your very significant contributions. And Robert Whitaker, please, your reactions.
Yeah, sure. I think the last sentiment is so telling. We don't know what schizophrenia is. And to pretend that we do is part of the problem in a way. And you both mentioned different definitions of schizophrenia. It has changed over time. And if you go back to Emil Kraepelin and you look at his description of his psychotic patients who deteriorated, which became his dementia praecox group, because he also had he had people with depression with psychotic features, and he had people with mania with psychotic features, and often those were episodic, and that became his manic depressive group. So psychosis wasn't the distinguishing feature for Emil Kraepelin's dementia praecox patients. If you go back to his description of his dementia praecox patients, they showed a lack of effect. That was psychotic patients showing a lack of effect and often had trouble making willed movements, almost as if they had Parkinson's disease. And there was even some trouble distinguishing between dementia praecox patients and those with Parkinson's. And there was also then, in 1918, I think, a virus called encephalitis lethargica gets identified. And you see that people now say, well, some of the patients that maybe we were identifying with dementia praecox had encephalitis lethargica. My point is, if we go back to the Emil Kraepelin conception of schizophrenia as a necessarily deteriorating disorder, it comes from a group of patients that presents very differently than patients present today. So whatever's going on may be very different in terms of the biology, et cetera. Then Bleuler, as you said, found many people who remitted, in fact, and there was this heterogeneous course. And actually, I've often heard under Bleuler sort of 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That 1/3 remit, 1/3 do okay, and then 1/3 chronic course. So, but the biggest thing here is we have a diagnosis that lends itself to a really, quote, pessimistic understanding of course. And yet when we really dig into the diagnosis, we'd say we don't really know what it is. You see, the problem there, and I think we need to go back saying we don't know what it is and be open to more possibilities, of course. And the only other thing in terms of clinical perceptions here, to really understand, I think, how medications affect people long term, and this is one of the things that both Lex Wunderink did and Martin Harrell did, you've got to get them in on first episode. So you've got to start following that trajectory of people right from the beginning. Because one of the things that Martin Harrell found was those who took themselves off medication and did well disappeared. They left the system. They did not come back to psychiatrists because they were taking themselves off against the will. The people who came back were those who took themselves off and relapsed. And so what he said is we lose sight, he called it the clinician's illusion in this study, we lose sight of people diagnosed with these severe disorders who basically drop out of care, stop taking their medications, and do well. And then you end up, obviously, treating people who, in one way or another, stay in treatment. And so you're actually not going back. If you go back to that first cohort, you're not seeing the complete cohort. You're actually seeing the cohort that stayed in care and often went on and off medication. And he says that's a sort of limitation of clinical experience. And one of the things, going back to this idea of evidence-based medicine, is the clinician's experience is limited. And it's limited in a way that science hopefully can illuminate a greater perspective. And I think from the perspective of the doctor, you see the drugs work. By and large, people come in, they get better. You see they work. Now, you don't have experience with unmedicated patients today because basically they're put on medication. So you don't see the course of sort of treated but unmedicated psychosis. And then people, at least in the United States, they leave the hospital or they leave whatever, and often they don't like the antipsychotics. I don't know how it is in Brazil, but they say, I don't want to be on these drugs. They throw them away, and they relapse. And so you see those people who relapse. They come back, and you see your clinical experience says they need to be on these medications. But what you haven't seen is the possibility of supporting people with psychosocial care, some sort of selective use protocol right from the beginning. Let's say all of you are psychotic patients. Now, you're going to separate yourself into different long-term courses, but that's not what the clinician sees right from the beginning. And I think science is saying, let's go back to this beginning and see possibilities. And as far as clozapine, I hear this all the time. It produces a better outcome. I think that's probably true. But even with the clozapine patients, you're not seeing, at least in the United States, a lot of employment. You're seeing a lot of weight gain, people still on disability, that sort of thing. And so really the opportunity, I think, here is this. Is science telling us that if we go back to the moment when people have that first break, which often is 18, 19, 20, 21, lives are in the balance, can we adopt a different protocol right from the beginning that maximizes the possibility people are not going to be on medications for life and are going to have a psychotic episode, not a chronic course? And then even if they need to be on medications for a time, can we go down to low doses or maybe even get some people off? And then some people are going to need medications long term. I believe that. And some people are going to have a chronic course. That's true. But when you start with 100 patients, you don't know who is which is going to be the course. And I think the challenge here for clinicians is really difficult. There's risks, there's uncertainty, but I think science is really telling us we need to embrace the risk and embrace the uncertainty. That's what I think.
Okay, I'd like to thank you, Robert Whitaker, for your sharp answers. And now, after this fascinating debate, I kindly invite the audience to take the word and formulate their questions direct to Mr. Whitaker. Those who are following us over the internet can send their observations to the email here, mpeira@fcm.unicamp.br, mpereira@fcm.unicamp.br. Now, for the audience questions.
Esse microfone é automático. É automático, pode começar a falar, ele... Isso. Se aproxima e começa a falar, ele deve...
Pode falar.
Hello, my name is Juliana. I am child psychiatrist, and my theme of my thesis is from child bipolar disorder, and it was very surprise for me when I found your books, The Anatomy of an Epidemic and Bipolar Children. You have an participation, because I made a long, a very big review of the medical articles about a very simple hypothesis of the use of psychostimulant and antidepressive in child who could made this astonishing number of bipolar disorder in American society. And then I am very interested in see how it works here in Brazil, because we are very, we go very close to United States in psychiatry. My question is, I have two questions. One is, I would like to think this epidemic of child bipolar disorder like an culture-bound syndrome. Because if you compare the epidemiologic dates, nowhere have the numbers like United States. You have some of them, but another thing, and one place where it is very close is Brazil. We have a place where these taxes are very close, and then I'm worried about that. And I would like to ask you, what do you think about this kind of I don't know if it's a provocative, but this kind of idea, like a culture bound, it's difficult because we know about the power of American psychiatry. Then it can be a short culture bound. I think in 5 years, not more. And the other thing is, what do you think about this? Because I think it's a good hypothesis, but there's more things in American society who that can contribute for this. I think the way American society is organizing, and I would like to hear of you about this.
Sure. First, I want to apologize if I've been speaking too fast. I get sort of wrapped up in these stories, and I start speaking too fast, and I almost forget that I'm speaking to Portuguese speakers. So if I've been speaking too fast, I apologize. I should learn Portuguese. So the question is this. How in the United States did we end up with so many bipolar youth? We even have a prevalence now, the studies come up with different prevalences, but in some studies it's 1 in 50, 1 in 40. I mean, it's really remarkable. And if you look at the rise of juvenile bipolar disorder, because in the past, if you go back in the 60s and 70s and even early 80s, the idea was that manic depressive illness or bipolar illness was an illness of the matured personality. It did not happen to youth. So how did all of a sudden we get all these bipolar youth? And you can trace it, which is what I do in that book. One is we began medicating our children with stimulants for ADHD. Now, stimulants are known So they do cause psychotic symptoms in a certain percentage of youth, and when that happens, they get diagnosed now not with amphetamine-induced psychosis, but they get diagnosed with bipolar disorder. But that's an iatrogenic course to a bipolar diagnosis. And you can also see this. Amphetamines are stimulants, right? So you get this rise in this arousal of emotions, and then you start crashing as the amphetamines leave your body. So you're setting up a roller coaster in youth and an emotional instability, in essence, and that will lead to a diagnosis. Second, you can look at antidepressants in youth. We do know that antidepressants can stir manic symptoms in people of all ages. There was a very large study in Yale that categorized or evaluated the risk of stirring manic symptoms, and it was highest in 13-year-olds. There's a new study out by Ross Baldessarini that said something like 12% of youth on antidepressants suffered a manic episode in like 6 weeks. So that's another iatrogenic course where you're destabilizing people with these other psychotropic drugs. Then third, there is a cultural-bound element because of how you define it. So if you start to look at the definition of juvenile bipolar disorder, it was defined differently. You didn't need to have a severe manic episode. You didn't need to have a severe depressive episode. Next thing you knew, you sort of needed to be a kid who was moody and agitated. So we're really expanding the boundaries of that diagnosis. Now, who expands the diagnosis? Well, if you really look at when it became popularized, well, two things here. The diagnosis starts to be recognized when kids who are on antidepressants are becoming this mood instability, and doctors say, instead of blaming the antidepressants, they say, see, the antidepressants are unmasking this disorder in youth. But you want to say, well, it never got unmasked before, so maybe it's the drugs are causing it. So that was one way we started hearing this. And then it's definitely a commercial thing. So what happens in 1994? We get Risperdal on the market, a new atypical. And they want to start having markets for beyond just psychotic adults. And who steps forward? Joseph Biederman. And Joseph Biederman does a study in which he says that number of kids we've diagnosed with ADHD are comorbid for bipolar disorder. And he just says this. And he says like 25% of kids that have ADHD are now comorbid. Well, who loves that? Risperdal loves it. I mean, Janssen, the maker of Risperdal, loves this because now we can take all these kids on ADHD and give them antipsychotics. And you can see documents in which Janssen gives money to Biederman. And what do the documents say? You will validate bipolar disorder, that's one, as a real disorder. And he got $1.6 million for this, and his partner got $1.2 million. 2, you will show that Risperdal is good for those kids. And 3, you'll show that they need it for life. So basically you see in those documents that this doctor, Biederman, was going to deliver a lifelong stream of patients to the maker of Risperdal. And you can see even in some of the documents where representatives of Janssen are going to the meetings where Biederman is promoting this idea, and the representatives of the drug companies are saying, and those doctors are buying it. He's convincing them that this is true, this is a real disorder. So you can see a market expansion happening there. Now, initially in the 90s, when we were diagnosing so many kids with bipolar disorder, the rest of the world was, those crazy Americans. In Europe, don't they know bipolar doesn't happen in youth? It's just those crazy Americans. But we exported that crazy idea to you. It's remarkable. Around the world we exported it. And then finally, is there a cultural element in terms of how we are raising our kids so they're not getting as much emotional stability as they might? Absolutely. I don't know enough about Brazilian society, but our kids aren't playing enough. Our kids are in the houses too much. They're in front of computers too much. They spend too much time in school. They have too much homework. Parents are working. They're not in the house. So there's all sorts of cultural influences that do make it harder for kids to organize their behaviors today that they weren't 30 years ago. So it's many, many things. But we as a society, I think, should be asking ourselves, how come kids didn't used to get manic depressive illness? And how come they're getting it today? And then maybe we in society need to think about doing something different. So rather than putting them on antipsychotics, we should think of something different to help them get emotional stability. But it's a commercial story. It's a tragic story, in my opinion.
Okay. Ok. Clarice Dantas.
Vou começar.
Vou começar. Hello, my name is Clarissa. I am a teacher here at the Department of Psychiatry at this university. I'm a colleague of Claude. Specifically, I work with psychotic patients also, schizophrenic patients. Well, I'm glad you're here. When I first came across your first book, Made in America, I was very impressed. What you write and what your talks are very thought-provoking, really thought-provoking. What I would like to ask you, I'm pretty sure you must have heard this question before, is when you present data on disability to psychiatric disorders, actually you are presenting data on people having some sort of social or financial benefits for being considered disabled by mental illness. So what I want to know is that isn't it possible that we just have a larger, coverture, some sort of social program paying benefits, financial benefits to people, and not really a larger number of people who are really disabled by mental disorders?
Yeah, of course, this is a great question, and I do get this question all the time. First of all, when I did the book, I was really looking at the disability numbers to raise a question. You know, okay, now at least it raises the question of why this is happening. I don't think it proved anything. However, if you look now that at least in the United States, they're giving us much more information about who is going on to disability, what's driving the numbers. It's not psychotic disorders at all. It's affective disorders. It's depression, and it's really bipolar. So bipolar, if you go back in history, manic depressive illness, if you look at the prevalence of bipolar, for example, now there's diagnostic problems with this too, but nevertheless, it was considered a fairly infrequent. You know, the prevalence in any one year might be like 1 in 3,000 would have a bipolar episode, that sort of thing. So you do have to ask, where are all the bipolar patients coming from today that are going on to disability? Because the prevalence has gone up in the United States now, again, it's something supposedly 1.5% to 2% of all adults have bipolar. And you do see some really iatrogenic gateways to a bipolar diagnosis. You know iatrogenic, meaning treatment caused? So if you look at people with a bipolar diagnosis in the United States, something like 60% had their first manic episode after going on an antidepressant. So you can see a gateway here. You have a milder problem, depression, maybe an episodic illness. You go on an antidepressant, you have a manic episode, and now you're in the bipolar category, which is treated, at least in the United States, with polypharmacy, and a certain percentage of those now go on to disability. So what is driving the disability numbers in the United States is the increasing chronicity of sort of treatment-resistant depression. That's one. But also bipolar. And if you look at gateways to bipolar in the United States, it's we've expanded the boundaries, but also antidepressants, stimulants, marijuana, and other illegal drugs. So if you see what's happening, it's a lot of sort of psychotropic drug use, illegal and illegal, inducing a mood stability, expanded diagnoses, and then once they get, and in the United States, if you get a diagnosis, you're usually on 2, 3, 4 drugs, and a lot of those people end up on disability. So there's a sense in which this paradigm of care, I think, is indeed driving the disability numbers, beyond what you're saying.
Thank you, Mr. Whitaker, for your lecture. And it certainly gives us some food for thought. And I have actually a personal question. I would like to know how you became interested in studying this question. How do you started writing about this? So it's some sort of curiosity, personal curiosity about that. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. I actually had no interest in psychiatry, none really, historically. It was really completely happenstance. Here's what happened. In 1994, I left, so I'd been a newspaper journalist, then I was director of publications at Harvard Medical School, and then in 1994, I co-founded a publishing company that focused on reporting on the development of new drugs. We were actually a very industry-friendly publication. It was while I was doing that publication, though, I began to see drug development in a new light. And one of the things I saw was in the studies of the atypical antipsychotics. So when they were introduced in the United States, they were introduced to these incredibly breakthrough medications, so much safer and more effective than the old drugs. And what I did is I used a Freedom of Information request to see what the FDA thought of the new drugs. And there were two things. One, the FDA said you've biased these trials by design to make the new drugs look better than the old, and they use different dosages. That was one. Two, they actually had a lot of adverse effects, the new drugs, including a lot of deaths in the olanzapine trial. And so I saw here that a little bit of the, my eyes opening, that the very trials I thought were really meant to assess the safety and efficacy were being designed in ways to create a marketing story that would make the drugs look better than the old. And so this was a moment of maturation for me. And I knew that there were deaths. So, for example, there were deaths in the trials of the atypicals, and then you'd go to the scientific literature and they would not mention the deaths. So I went to the Boston Globe then at this point and said, I'll do and I thought this was an abuse of patients in research settings, not to be honest. And then I also stumbled upon studies in which people had come into emergency rooms, these were funded by the NIMH, with psychotic symptoms. And rather than treat those people with an antipsychotic, they gave them amphetamines to make them worse, with the idea that giving them dopamine-releasing drugs would somehow help them study the biology of psychosis. And I pulled the consent forms, and they weren't telling people we're giving you drugs to make you worse. So anyway, I went to the Boston Globe, which I'd written for, and I said, I'll do a series of abuses of patients in psychiatric research studies. And then the third group of studies were studies in which they had withdrawn antipsychotic medication from schizophrenia patients, and I said, that's unethical. These drugs are like insulin for diabetes. You should never withdraw an antipsychotic from a schizophrenia patient, right? If it's like insulin for diabetes. So I did that series. And I didn't want I really had no particular interest. But here's what happened. I had just done this series saying you should never withdraw antipsychotics. And I stumbled upon the World Health Organization studies that said outcomes are better in the poor countries, and that living in a rich country is a strong predictor that you won't do well. And then I investigated that, and I found that they were using the medications differently. And so all of a sudden what I thought to be knew to be true, and I had condemned psychiatrists for running studies in which they'd taken people off, maybe wasn't true. And I think here's the important part of this. I was rewarded for that series. So I won what's called a George Polk Award, which is a very prestigious award. I was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in Public Service, which is the best award in all of American journalism. It's not just a Pulitzer Prize, it's the best one. And I thought I had it wrong. I thought maybe this part where we had talked about withdrawing people so it was so horrible, maybe I had it wrong. And I wrote Mad in America to sort of investigate why do people in rich countries have such poor outcomes when they're so diagnosed. And then once in Mad in America, I became fascinated by sort of competing narratives. There's the narrative told by society about how it's treating people. There's a narrative told by doctors about how they're treating people. And then there's this other narrative that isn't listened to by people who are treated, and they often have very different conceptions of the treatment. But that doesn't get into the history, and I felt I want to make that part of the history. And then finally going to you about conceptions, you can see that treatment also follows how we conceive of people who are psychotic. Are they worthy? Or are they threats to society? And you can see that the measure of effectiveness has a lot to do with how you value the people in the first place. So the answer to your story is people think I must have a personal involvement. I don't. It was just curiosity born of stumbling upon this medical failure.
Good morning, firstly. I actually have a question. It's not so related to the last questions. It's about the use of, in recent years, the past years, there has been an increase in the use of antipsychotic drugs in off-label uses. For example, the Seroquel that AstraZeneca uses, that it used under another brand name, for everything, to headaches, to flu, to everything under the sun. And there has been a lot of settlements from pharmaceutical companies in this kind of cases, that people would bring up charges and then they would make like big billion-dollar settlements on this, and everything will be forgotten. And if there is this increasing problems for using these antipsychotics, like you have shown us, in patients, in psychiatric patients, and the risk for the population that uses those off-label drugs that they shouldn't be using because they are antipsychotics and they theoretically shouldn't be for the general population. What is your opinion on these unethical uses?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. We've been talking about the risk-benefit ratio in the very population that drugs are meant for. We also agree that these are people in need of serious help. And even there you see questions about the risk-benefit ratio. And then all of a sudden you're going to apply that to kids that are misbehaving, because there's, at least in the United States, we give it for behavioral control in kids, or for sleep medication, or we control elderly people. That is a marketing exercise. That's not a scientific enterprise off-label. And the fines have been because basically the companies have pled guilty to criminal charges in which they hid adverse effects. They were paying psychiatrists and other doctors to promote off-label uses. You can look, for example, in this new book I have this, Alan Francis, who was the architect of DSM-4, basically entered into an agreement with, I think it was Janssen, to promote, the use of this drug and developing guidelines, et cetera. He was paid $800,000 by Janssen to do that. And we see this over and over again where the off-label marketing involved paying psychiatrists to say it's good for whatever, sleeping, headaches, controlling kids. Biederman got a lot of money for saying that you can use it to control agitation, control autism. That's just not a... Here's what's amazing to me. And they pled guilty to criminal charges. So Eli Lilly, which makes olanzapine, paid like $1.3 billion. Janssen paid in the billions for its off-label marketing of Risperdal. Every maker of an atypical antipsychotic has paid a huge fine for basically criminal marketing of these drugs for off-label purposes. What's amazing to me is, that it was so successful. There really was no evidence for it. They do these tiny trials by people who are completely biased. They present that. Yeah, it helps you sleep with... Okay, maybe it helps you sleep, but what is it doing to you? We have kids growing breasts from Risperdal, all sorts of horrible stuff. It was not a scientific enterprise, and yet it got embraced by a medical community. It shows how a medical community can be susceptible to marketing, especially if the marketing is done in the guise of science. And then the other thing is, after they paid the huge fines, it didn't matter. Do you know in 2008, I think it was, antipsychotics produced more revenue in the United States than any other class of drugs? Antipsychotics, which is remarkable. And it just shows that, and then I hear that it is even happening in Brazil and other countries, and all I can say is God help us, the influence of the United States to, that enterprise to influence psychiatric care in other countries is really remarkable. And it just shows that, you could be a psychiatrist and you can tell me I'm wrong, but I went to some of the APA meetings and about half of the psychiatrists there are from foreign countries. And from my understanding, they're not paying their own way. They're generally there on a ticket from the pharmaceutical companies. And then you would go to these things and say, oh, you can do it for sleep, you can do it for autism, you can do it for all these things. And you get these ideas promoted, and I think it's a disaster, basically. Especially the giving of antipsychotics to kids for behavioral control purposes. That's just insane.
I would like to ask a question too. One of the most amazing effects of the triumph of American psychiatry is the fact that we have nowadays the tendency to conceive psychiatric treatment around symptom controlling. But we assist the loss of importance of psychopathology as a perspective over mental disorder as a human fact, as a human experience. We treat symptoms, we don't treat persons nowadays. What are your perspectives about this tendency, this contemporary tendency?
Can I just add
Yes,
a
please.
remark and then to respond? I would say that what about people these days wanting quick fix?
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure.
And there's also this dismissal from the other side of this sort of rigorous psychopathology assessment.
Right.
And so you have a sort of win-win.
Right.
People are happy with quick fix and psychiatrists are happy with providing them.
Yeah, listen, I think this is one of the biggest social injuries that has happened from this new model of thinking, this conception. Now, the conception comes in 1980. I mean, basically, American psychiatry in 1980 says we're going to adopt a medical model. And what does a medical model do? It's really not a medical model. It's a disease model. So we're going to see distressing symptoms, depression or psychosis. We're going to say they're symptoms of a disease. And then with this disease model, we're going to say something's going wrong pathologically in the head. And we're not going to care what happened to people. If you have these symptoms, you get the diagnosis. And if you don't, you don't have it. And actually with DSM, even if you don't have the symptoms, there's other diagnoses, so you can give it to them anyway. It's such an impoverished way of thinking about human beings. It's an impoverished way of thinking about children and children developing. It's like a philosophy of being that is disjointed from human history. It's like a philosophy of being by people who've never read religious tracts. I mean, you think about the Bible. The Bible is about trying to organize your mind in a way that is pleasing to God. I mean, in other words, you struggle with your mind. What does literature tell us? You struggle with your mind. Everything tells us that life is difficult. Growing up is difficult. Human beings are these emotional creatures, and we struggle with our minds. Sometimes we're at war with our minds. That's normal. And even this sense that suffering can actually be a path to growth, that's absent. And even if you go back to, remember one of those 3 trials I mentioned about the NIMH and one by William Carpenter where they had better outcomes in the unmedicated patients? They then asked, why is this so? And they said this. They said to their unmedicated patients, what was it like to go through this without being medicated? And they said, it was hard. It was painful. But the majority said they were grateful to have had the opportunity to go through it without having their emotions numbed by the medications. And if you read that paper, and I think this goes to what you're talking about, Carpenter and his colleagues said maybe because of that, the pathological process they turned into an experience that made them better able to handle subsequent life stresses. That the pathology, whatever the psychotic symptoms, for some people, going through it became a place for growth, I guess, and for strength and for understanding. Now that's completely missing. So what we now have a system of care that is absent psychology, right? You just have these symptoms, and we don't say that things happen between people, which we all know is true. We all know that we are social creatures, and distress so much arises from what's happening in between people, which is how the Finnish people conceive of in northern Finland. We just say your problem's in your head. So the youth that comes from a bad home today and has a foster care, we say the problem's you. You have ADHD, you have bipolar. It's not that you were born into a family that can't keep you safe and nurture you. And then we say people who are sunk into depression and they're dealing with the poverty, broken families. It's not a social situation. You have a brain chemistry. What a horrible, impoverished sense of what it means to be alive, and it is a barrier, I think, to social justice, social reform. It's just a horrible way to think of yourself, in my opinion. Horrible.
Well, unfortunately, we need to close our discussion. I would like to thank you very much, Mr. Whitaker, for this fascinating debate and for your presence here with us. And I know that you'll be there at Unicamp when you'll be there here?
In November.
November.
What's the date again? 15.
Okay. He'll be back once again.
Question is,
November
can I learn
15th.
Portuguese by November 15th?
Well, and thank you, Paulo Galarramundo and Claudio Banzat, for their very precious contributions, for everyone here and over internet, and thank you again, Robert Whitaker.
Thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Okay.